been a bit of a crazy week. We got a new camera and something went wrong, and so we decided to re-record this. And it's been a busy week. My wife, her father is in the hospital right now. And so I didn't have time to go up to the church building. So we're recording this in a little different location. Hopefully it turns out okay. Many of you have probably had the experience of going to some of the bigger church meetings. Places where there are 1,500 to 2,000 people gathered together in one place to worship God. And it's an amazing experience to be with so many Christians who are excited and share the same passion and the same goals. As a teenager, I used to go to those meetings. And I have to admit, it was more because that's where all the girls were at the time. But you have to talk to them before they want to go out with you, so that didn't work so well. But anyway, at the meetings, I had a nickname. It was not the most pleasant nickname. My nickname was Wall Boy. It probably doesn't take much imagination for you to figure out why I was called that. Because while everyone else was out in the center of the room talking and visiting and having fun with one another, I was up against a wall or in a corner. If I was lucky, I was talking to an older person. But people have said that I am socially retarded. And they're probably not far off. You know, for some of us, being in big groups, it makes us uncomfortable. And so we have a tendency to go almost at the opposite extreme. We have a tendency to think that we don't need people. We're raised as being very self-sufficient, and our society reinforces those ideas. All we have to do is turn on the TV and we see shows today about people who are preparing for the end of the world, preparing for natural disasters. A lot of them are called preppers. It's all about self-sufficiency. And because we've been raised that way and because it is reinforced in our world, we have a tendency to not think that we need other people either. It's also reinforced because people are messy. People are not easy to get along with. But we need those connections even if we don't think that we do. Many of you know my dad pretty well. Dad is not someone who really comes across as a people person. As a matter of fact, when he was working, he didn't think he needed very many people. But once he retired, he realized that he did need people. He needed those connections and he missed them. And so now anytime there's a baseball game or a basketball game or one of the kids is doing something at church, he tries to be there. Not because he cares about any of those sports, but because he cares about the people. This weekend I talked to someone who said that the less they interacted with people, the more depressed they became. Now I want us to think about this little rabbit hole. Because the less we interact with people, often the more depressed we become. And then the more depressed we become, the less we want to interact with people. And we head down this path that is not a healthy one for us. Like it or not, God created us to crave company. He created us to need that interaction with other people. For some of us, groups can be uncomfortable. But we need to remember that it's not just about us. There are times when I may not need you, but you may need me. There are also other times when you may not need me, but I need you. Origen writes this. He says, "The communities of God to which Christ has become teacher and guide are in comparison with the communities of the pagan people among whom they live as strangers, like heavenly lights in the world." John writes almost the same thing in biblical language. In 1 John chapter 3 and verse 14, he says, "We know that we have passed out of death into life because we love the brethren." Listen to this last part though. He says, "He who does not love abides in death." If we are going to be transformed in our hearts, and if we are going to be transformed into the image of Christ, then we have to look at our relationships with others. And we have to ask ourselves if the relationships that we have with others are the kind of relationships that God would want us to have. We need the security of people around us. There's no way for us to be physically healthy, spiritually healthy, or emotionally healthy without those connections. In the book Renovation of the Heart, Dallas Willard uses a phrase that I love. And I think that that phrase really embodies the things that we're talking about today. He says that we need circles of sufficiency. And I love that. Those are circles of people that contain the things that we need to make it through our daily lives. Perhaps the simplest example is a relationship between a mother and a child. That child cannot live healthy. That child really can't even live without his mother. She takes care of her child's physical needs, of her child's emotional needs, and takes care of her child's spiritual needs, and takes care of him in every other way imaginable. Without the mother, the young child would die, unless someone else was willing to step up and to step into that role. But every circle that we have depends on a larger circle underneath it to support it. If everything is going to be okay, it's not enough to just have one circle. The mother and the child need a larger circle to support them. Usually that circle involves dad, or it involves mom and dad, or it involves her parents or his parents. And then the next circle is even larger. It involves the extended family. And then we have a circle that is underneath that. Maybe it is our community, maybe it is our church. And finally we get to the point where there's only one circle that is large enough to support everything above it. And that's the circle that has God and Jesus and the Holy Spirit at the center of it. They support one another. We can say that we only need one circle. Maybe it's just us, maybe it's our family. But the reality is that's not true. Sometimes we say that we only need God. And that sounds good. It almost sounds like biblical language, doesn't it? But that's not what God intended. God designed each of us to need each other. We all talk about being self-sufficient. But the reality of life is there is no such thing. There is no way for us to rely only on ourselves. And there is no way for us to only rely on our families. We live in an interconnected world, and that's how God designed us. We often find, unfortunately, that our circles become broken for one reason or another. And the only place that we find true healing is in that center circle, that circle of God. Of course, it's not God's plan that our circles be fragile. It's not God's plan that they be broken. And if we really do our best to work in His kingdom and to live in His kingdom, then our circles can begin to heal. But we're all human, and there are times when our circles will be broken. When we talk about these circles of sufficiency, one of the dangers, that's a scary one, is that of rejection, of being left out or not being welcomed, because it's not enough for us to just have our physical needs met. Recently, researchers observed the development of some infants who were raised in orphanages. Now, the orphanages that they were in, the ratio of care workers to infants was very low. And while the infants were properly fed, most of them were left alone in their cribs with very little physical contact. These children suffered from severe delays of physical growth. They had problems with behavioral development. They had elevated risks of serious infection. Even these babies who didn't know that they needed people, They needed that interaction. They needed that physical touch. They needed others to be physically happy and to be emotionally happy. The final words of the Old Testament speak of one who must come and restore the hearts of the fathers to their children and the hearts of the children to their fathers. We have to remember, we have to understand that connections are important. There are a lot of things that can break our connections to each other. There are a lot of things that can leave us on our own. Failures, either real ones or imagined ones. And I know that sounds strange when I say real or imagined. But one of the things that I find fascinating is talking to people who have been really good friends for lots of years, and then something happens and they depart. You get completely different stories when you talk to one person versus the other. And sometimes the problems that they have are very real. Other times they are things that were very small, that were not real problems, but they were imagined as bigger. And it gets bigger and bigger. Rejection can get in our way. Unfaithfulness, divorce, failures in our career advancement, and even things we wouldn't think about. Even children can get in the way as we attempt to connect with one another. And when those things get in the way, they leave us unconnected. They leave us unconnected at levels where our soul needs nourishment. And if we're unconnected long enough, we begin to die a spiritual starvation. As we start at this foundation, as we begin to deal with the spiritual formation of that social dimension that's within us, we have to start by understanding that we're all wounded. We're all broken to some degree. All of us have been injured in our relationships with one another. And there are often many ways that this happens, but there's two big ones. People either attack us or people withdraw from us. And unfortunately, these ideas are so much a part of society that we look at them as normal. When we look at our relationships with those in the world, it happens all the time. And so we have a tendency to think that it's normal. But if we're going to succeed in our spiritual formation, we have to find a way out. When we attack others, we attack against what is good for them. And when we withdraw from someone, we regard their well-being and we regard their goodness as matters of indifference to us. We just don't care. Really what it comes down to is one thing. In both of these instances, when we are attacking and when we are withdrawing, we're thinking about us. We're being selfish. Dallas Willard writes this. He says, spiritual formation, good or bad, is always profoundly social. You cannot keep it to yourself. Anyone who thinks of it merely as a private matter has misunderstood it. Anyone who says it is just between me and God, or what I do is my own business, has misunderstood God as well as me. He goes on to say, strictly speaking, there is nothing just between me and God. For all that is between me and God affects who I am, and that in return modifies my relationship to everyone around me. My relationship to others also modifies me, and deeply affects my relationship to God. Hence, those relationships must be transformed if I am to be transformed. I love this thought. Our interactions with each other affect our relationship with God. And our relationship with God affects our interactions with one another. There is a whole dimension that is tied together. Excuse me. That no matter how hard we try, we can't get away from. When we are transformed, it transforms our relationships with others. Jesus made sure that we understood the importance of these things. In John chapter 13 and verse 35, he says this, by this all will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another. You know, a lot of times we read that verse, but do we remember what he said in the previous verse? In John chapter 13 and verse 34, he says, a new commandment I give to you, that you love one another as I have loved you, that you also love one another. That age-old commandment that he gave now has been transformed. It's not enough to love. It's not enough to just simply love the kind of love most of us think about. We have to love with the same kind of love that Jesus has for us. And I want you to notice that the apostle did not mince words. He was very clear here. He says, he who does not love abides in death. 1 John chapter 3 and verse 14. I want us to think about this. He doesn't say that we have to hate to abide in death. He said, if we do not love, we abide in death. The mere absence of love is enough to be deadly. It is withdrawal. Now this week, Christy and Carly came home on, I don't remember what day it was, and we met at Dickie's for lunch. As we were eating lunch there with Dad, Carly started telling me some of the stories of things that she had been doing, and I looked up in the corner, and on the TV there was a really cool 1939 Oldsmobile. Now I'm trying to listen to my daughter, but there's also a 1939 Oldsmobile in the corner. And so I'm looking at her, and I'm looking at the car. Looking at her, looking at the car. It didn't take long until she stopped her story, and she stood. Well, she didn't stand, she was sitting. But she just stared at me. What was she telling me? She was saying, Dad, I want your attention. And what was I telling her? I was telling her, I didn't mean to, but I was telling her that car up in the corner on the TV is more important than you. I can't tell you the number of times that people have asked me a question, and then as I'm looking at them to answer the question, they're looking over my shoulder, looking around, trying to decide who they want to talk to next. Do you know what they've just told me? They've just said, I don't care about you. I don't care about your question. And we do those kinds of things so often and unintentionally. It's easy to do this, but it's also hurtful. It was hurtful to Carly. And if we're honest, we will admit that it's hurtful to us. I also want us to notice what he didn't say in this verse too. He did not say, he who is not loved. Although that's true, if we're not loved, that will bring death. Our purpose cannot be to get others to love us. Our purpose has to be for us to show others love. And that love will be reciprocated. Amy Carmichael was criticized for her humanitarian work. She responded by saying this. I love what she says. She says, one cannot save and then pitchfork souls into heaven. Souls are more or less securely fastened to their bodies. And as you cannot get souls out and deal with them separately, you have to take them together. Because people are not easy. Because people are messy. Sometimes we just focus on their souls. And we forget about the important part of the relationships that we have. Love is not easy. People are messy. But love is not just a feeling. Love is a divine way of relating to one another. It's never easy, but it's much easier when we start acting like we love. In his book, Mere Christianity, C.S. Lewis wrote this. He said, do not waste your time bothering whether you love. Act as if you do. As soon as we do this, we find one of the bigger secrets. When you are behaving as if you love someone, you will presently come to love him. If you injure someone you dislike, you will find yourself disliking him more. If you do him a good turn, you will find yourself disliking him less. Most of the time when we think about acting in a loving way towards someone, we forget about the opposite side. We forget that if we injure someone, that we will dislike them even more. Paul wanted our relationships with one another to be genuine. He wanted that social dimension to be honest, to be open, to be caring, to be loving, and to be genuine. That should be the center of the things that we do today in our relationships with one another and in our assembly. In Romans chapter 9, verses 9 through 21, we see a lot of qualities exhibited. And one of the things that I want you to do this week, if you have time, is to go home and read from Romans chapter 12, verses 9 through 21. Because there we see that we should be letting love be real. We should abhor what is evil. We should cling to what is good. We should be devoted to one another in a family-like love. We should be outdoing one another as we give each other honor. We should be loving the Lord with all of our spirit and with diligence. We should be rejoicing in hope, being patient in our troubles. We should be devoted constantly to prayer, helping by contributing to the needs of the saints. We should be pursuing, or that word really means running after hospitality, wanting to be together, blessing persecutors and not cursing them. We should be joyful, even for those who reject us. We should be joyful for those who are joyful and sorrowful for those who are sorrowful. We should live in harmony. We should not be haughty, but we should fit in with those who are even the lowest. We should not see ourselves as wise. We should never repay evil. We should have a due regard for everyone. We should be at peace, as much as it depends on us. We should not take revenge. We should provide for our enemies. And we should not be overwhelmed by evil, but we should overwhelm that evil with good. If you have a chance, read that passage. It's an amazing passage that I think will encourage us to be genuine in our relationships. Now, there are a lot of scriptures that talk about love. But here we see a great picture of what love looks like in a social situation. How do you think our relationships with one another would change if we spent time working on those things? Not if we spent time saying, I wish people would treat me like that. But what do you think would happen if we decided we were going to treat everyone like that? Spiritual formation in Christ is not just about us. It's about helping others. It's about being part of that circle of sufficiency that supports the other circles above us. Let's do our part to be that circle for someone else. Because while we may not need them today, we know that in the future, we're going to need those circles to support us. And so it's our turn today to support them.